Hi, my name is Benedict. This is episode 3 of the Simple Songwriting series. I'm only planning to have one part of this. This episode is a rather different track. It comes with the charming name of Doom Song, and it's showing how this format that I've been teaching you of working from chord progressions applies across any genre, even those that don't appear to be very traditional or even necessarily chord-based in their structure. So, we'll give you an idea of what we're working from. The track is called Doom Song. So obviously really very, very different from Jake's Falling Down in Love. And yes, that is my vocal. No, it is not particularly good. It is not necessarily meant to be good, merely representative of something that might fit in this kind of mix. It's not even properly a written song. I just made up some pretty well gibberish lines as I went. So they weren't even written down. I just had the mic on, front of the speakers, put it down. It was enough to give us the feel of that. So let me show you how this is put together. You can already see there's a full song, but initially you might be thinking, well, how does that come out of this chord idea? Well, let me show you. We'll start by grabbing these guys and bringing them to life, so to speak. Let's pop them in solo. That's our chord progression. That is it. So we can now, we mute this and we pick just guitar 1. Same. So what the guitar is playing is actually very simple. It's not even playing chords. A lot of time in very extreme metal, they're not necessarily doing a lot of chords. In doom metal or early doom metal, single lines were quite common. The music was often written in a somewhat medieval, pre-polyphonic form. So each instrument was often playing just a single line, and they would often all track together, so little to no harmonies, which gave this really nice sort of dark, doomy sound. So incredibly simple. There is a little bit of extra, which we will get into. That's our first guitar. Our second guitar is doing the chugs. So the more complex material comes from a sense of just understanding how this style is made. Now, I know that there is a lot of pressure for the idea that we should be making exact, perfect stylings of whatever style we decide to do. It's really, really unwise, because if you manage to nail a particular act, doesn't matter whether you're looking at pop or a genre, whether it be EDM or some sub-genre of EDM, or metal and some sub-genre of metal. The reality is, if you manage to nail somebody else's thing, let's say I managed to nail Slayer, there is no more room in the world for Slayer, because there actually is an act called Slayer, and they did pretty darn well for themselves. One of the big 3 or 4 or whatever it's called. The reality is the world doesn't want another Slayer. And one of the first things that you'll notice when you go onto YouTube videos, especially within genre stuff, the first thing that people will do is go, oh, well, that sounds like Slayer, Iced Earth, whoever. And that's the last thing you want to have happen. Because if you're too easily identifiable as being just like Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran, Drake, Slayer, Iced Earth, Iron Maiden, whoever, the problem is you're easy to go, ooh, sounds like, but then you're immediately dismissed. Because when the person goes to press play on something else and it's their choice, do you think they're going to choose the real Slayer or a band that's done a so-so copy of? You don't want to do that. So make sure you go your own way and create your own sound. Yes, initially, and in some forums, if you're silly enough to hang around and listen to those people, they will tell you, but then look at what they're doing and look at how much success they have with their "this is how you do it" attitude, and you'll find that they're not. So if you're going to go out there and die with this, you might as well die with your boots on rather than somebody else's boots. Now, it took some effort to get this guitar sound. Not as much as you might initially think, simply because I've spent quite some time doing this kind of thing in the past. I have several metal albums which are purely electronic, so it's not 100% new, but it's always an exploring for me. It's like, what else can I pull out of this? So you'll notice that with the sounds, there's quite a lot of effort put into making them unique. And now you have to excuse me because I need to go let the cat out. Alright, cat back outside. You'll see I put a lot of effort into trying to find my own style. So I've put in pitch bends and mod wheel, which gives us the squeals in this case. Although the amplification in this situation is such that everything is on the verge of howling, and also switching in and out sustain pedals in particular situations, particularly on the number 2 line, which is the chugs. So some of them need to be chuggy and some of them need to be a little bit more open. You'll see I've carried across the pitch bends and mod wheel action that I've got because it's kind of quite consistent across this kind of metal, that they'll all tend to use the same performance style at around the same time. Again, that's part of that pre-polyphonic or medieval style of writing, and it provides a consistency, because if guitars are too, even though they're playing slightly different things, if they're too different, they kind of won't come together. So don't get too adventurous. Focus on the main feeling that you're getting across, and this is meant to be pretty darn driving. Come to driving, the next thing is bass, and this is the order in which I wrote things. The bass is again just taking from our chords. That's it. We've had to arrange some things a little differently, simply because sometimes with guitars, as I had last time, they bottom out at a certain note. They won't play past that. In this case, I've gone with that. I haven't done it Part of the unusual sound of this is because I chose an unusual key scale. Basically, I kind of made it up. Someone will have a name for this. Some academic, another guitarist can probably go, oh yeah, you just used this. That's cool. That's great. That's wonderful for them. Because obviously they can say to somebody else, well, this is what we used. This is our thing that we're all choosing to play together in. But because I'm not really playing with anybody else, it doesn't actually matter. But what I chose was, I wanted to root in an E because that is the low note of guitar. One of my instruments wouldn't play any lower. The bass sound itself wouldn't. It won't play any notes below the E. I wanted to look at it using a drop tuning because it's more metal. But it wasn't an option, seeing I was going to use that instrument. Because again, I wanted to use samples for this being like what most people would do. And I wanted to just see how brutal I could get this precision bass to sound. So that limited me, but I still wanted to work in something like C major. But obviously, if you're lifting your guitar, so there, suddenly that isn't as metal as that. So I used the logical, lazy conclusion, which was to say, okay, let's act like we're in E, but also act like we're in C. Rather than using the C major, sorry, an E major, which puts black keys in there, far too complex for me, I said, okay, fine. So it's a minor chord. And because we're mixing and matching, we end up with an unusual feel. That unsettling feel is a thing I do a lot, but it's also very much suited to Doom, because Doom is meant to be unsettling in a dark forest, bad things around you, gloomy, blah, blah, blah. So again, our guitars and bass, you can see there's no difference. They're essentially playing the same lines, just a little bit of variety in how they set up their rhythm. So together with our guitars, the idea is that by all playing together, they create quite a monolithic sound. Mono being one, but big and doomy, so it's sort of slow because it's a slow tempo, but also because there isn't any harmonic movement. Somebody told me off once for a Doom thing that I wrote, there's no harmonic movement in there. I was like, Mr. Perfect and knows all about music. Yeah, didn't last long with me, that fella. Back to our guitars. You'll see that we've got these extra little bits. These are vitally important, but easily forgotten. Now, this information applies whether you're doing EDM or metal or anything. And I spoke about this in Series 2 about detail. It's ornamentation and how we handle, how we move from place to place and how we ornament our music is where our true uniqueness comes from. Yes, my sounds here may be unique. My chord progression isn't. My unusual use of key and scale really isn't, because I'm not going to be the first person. As I said, somebody who's a musicologist or trained enough is going to put up their hand and go, oh yes, that's a Mixolydian Dorian cross blah blah blah. great, brilliant, and I'm delighted. But it's not unique. It's unusual, but it's not unique. So what sets us apart a little bit more is how we choose to apply detail, and that is this ornamentation. You hear this all the time in metal, because metal tends to be, in some ways, quite stripped back, especially post-blues metal. So once we got further into the 80s and they stepped further and further away from the blues base of metal, then it tended to actually become, well, simpler and simpler. Noisier and noisier, faster and faster, but often simpler and simpler. So this is a way of adding in a little bit of movement, because otherwise without it, it's just a dirge and nothing is happening. So as such, this is providing a little bit of that harmonic movement. Not in the way of, really nicely fully composed Mahler or something like that, but the movement is there. This you can set up as you like, but still try to be aware of your chords, of at least roughly where we're going to end up. So it's an E. We've got an E down here. We've ended on E. We want to do that because it's a nice, comfortable ending. So that's a little uncomfortable, and that's good in this situation because it's meant to be unsettling. That's comfortable because that's part of a chord. That's part of the chord, but this one's not. Yeah. And then we've gone too comfortable, but we've pulled out of it. Because that's that. Yeah. But it's nice to pass through it. So that's creating both tension and release. We've got tension from the beginning of this, and then this line provides further tension and release because it falls back to where it belongs. And then moves to this new chord, which just so happens to be that note where we've started before. We essentially play the same thing and then a variant on that little extra. Ooh. So same pattern twice, but with a variant here. And so when this comes to apparent resolution, it's up here. So we've got safe, not safe. That's very safe because that's the top of our main chord. But we refuse to settle there and go back to this unsafe note, which provides more tension for us as we go back to our root note. As we crash back to our root note, literally in this form, we're just crashing from one place to another, we have resolved this because we've gone we're just not expressing that last resolution because we're moving it down here. Very comfortable, even though the whole thing is meant to be. So it's got this constant tension and resolution. One of the massive problems I hear in so much modern music where they've lost that sense of how music works and that there is a mechanic to it, that it's about our psychology, it's about our feelings. You walk up to a girl that you're thinking that you might like to date and go, "You're fat and you suck." You're probably not going to get a date, because you've created tension but no resolution. Whereas if you walk up to the girl, she's going to be tense because you've walked up to her. You say, oh, gee, I think you're pretty. She's tense because she's not sure where that's going. Would you like me to buy you dinner? Well, it's not to say there isn't some tension in that situation, but you've provided a resolution in the sense that in that moment, you've given a clear sense of what your intentions are. And when we're writing music, we've got to give a clear sense of what our intentions are. So we've started here. Ooh. Yeah. Ooh. So constant tension and resolution. Create resolutions often and early, especially if you're working in a repetitive form, EDM being an incredibly repetitive form. Our next guitar, our other guitar. This one does less initially, just our chugs. But then we've got this tension and resolution here. So we've got a, which is, let's go back to here, a G and a G. That's what our chord is. But we've also got these little ones below, so we've just copied because it's with guitars putting the octave on top, you don't fully notice it, but at the same time it bites harder. So we've not added any new notes, we've just added highlight. As our other one has its own highlights. Then as we get into this section, and you notice I'm constantly moving here, even though my basics are staying very rigid, very the same, we've now added another little section. So that is, what have we got? We got a C, even though we're an E. So we've got a root of E down below, and then we've used a C. Let's see if I can get this into the organ playing by looking at the guitar. No, organ, I want you to play. Sometimes this is just obtuse. I don't want to do it. So that's essentially our chord, except we've inverted it. So we're using, and then, which is, as you hear, tense, and then our E, which is our root note. So it's all part of using the way the chords work. And then up to G, which is again comfortable. E, G is our chord. Is essentially what we're playing. And that could well be have been a solo in here. And then our chord moves up to an A, so we're going comfortable. Not quite so. Not quite so, but it is the root of our piece. So see how we're just moving around using a basic understanding of our theory and how our chords work. Remember in the last one I showed you with a little graphic on the screen of a keyboard of 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5. Once we understand those, then we can move around those very safely, and we're constantly providing tension and release. When we look at our things that are being played here, you'll see that they sort of move backwards and forwards. Whilst this is fairly simple, this is complex. Whilst this is staying simple, this is getting a little complex. So we're moving backwards and forwards. We've got our guitars panned, and they're always providing interest. We listen to just our guitars. There's a little from both, but we tend to keep things moving. And there are times where we deliberately have them come together and do the same things, which I do a lot more later, but that provides us with our structure, which is all just from this. Now the next thing that I did with the chords is this is the chords as I wrote them. So we've got come up. Actually, let's go C, G. That's our whole chord progression to that point. Goes up to A, but that's a fair jump. And then works its way back down again. This one looks different, but looks the same. The reason being is that these notes are kind of high. So if I take these notes here that are a little high and move them to down low, that's an E, and I move it to an E, see? It now becomes more even. So this chord progression with the jump is also this. Now I could have left this up high. Come here. Stop note. It's consistent with the first part, or I can make it more doomy, more down. And these are exactly our chords. So exactly the same notes, it's just where we place them. And this is really, really important. It's a way of making the most of and evening out your chord progression. So here is a big leap. Whereas if we take the top note here and roll it back down, we've got which evens things out quite a lot. So don't be afraid to say, if I've got, let's say, a C major chord, we can express it this way, 1, 3, 5, or we can go 1, 3, 5 but move the 5 to an octave below. It's the same chord. Sometimes you have to be a little bit careful. You want to be slightly cautious, even though I have done it and will continue to do it, of using an inversion as your very first chord, because then it kind of says to people, well, we're probably in a G because that's our bass note. But nonetheless, that's not the same as that. So for some bizarre reason, human beings, even with no musical education, have some way of working out what these things are. It's just a given language. Like we know when it's sunny and we know when it's not. it's a given part of us. So if this isn't to your liking, you can choose to voice it as this. You can choose to voice it as this. That's moving our E. Or that. You can drop that down as well. Sounds cool. So there are lots of different ways of choosing to voice the one chord. The notes are the same, 1, 3, 5. We can voice them differently. Where your chord progression has your chords leap a fair way, that can be good, because you're saying something about what's happening. Ooh, suddenly it's getting brighter. Or as a big leap in some way. But if you don't want that big leap, then simply take, say, your top note and roll it down. And you've still got all the same notes. Obviously, you've got to see how it feels when it comes out, because sometimes as you move those notes around, you can end up with a very different feel from what you wanted. You've still got to go with the feel, but if your notes are getting a little too spread out, you can move them. So that's what I've done in this situation, and that provides a thicker sound, which we're all about in this situation. So now that those are finished with, we'll close them down. We don't actually need those anymore. They do appear later in the piece. So by this point, I had guitars, bass. I should just mute the things I didn't have. Yeah, guitars, bass. Came time for drums. Yes, you will notice when I stop that guitar goes blah, 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 blah. That's an echo. That's all part of the mixing. In this case, I had made the sounds up a fair amount by the time I started to compose, because it was going to influence the way I composed, but I still had my chord progression there first. And then it was like, okay, I need to make these sounds kind of mechanically the way they would behave, so I can work out how to make them get the squeals in this situation. Bass done, and I hadn't gone through any mixing as such, and then we come to drums. Again, I just used the Melder kit. Sorry, not Melder, MT Power. Melder's different mob of people, and pulled out some grooves. I had to look for things that kind of suited what I was doing. I didn't want just a straight rock thing as such, or definitely didn't want disco or whatever, because it needed to reinforce the plodding feel of this. So I looked around a little bit till I found something that worked, dragged them off. I did go back in as time went by and add a little bit more to them, because they didn't always work the way that I wanted them to. So I wanted a little bit of extra metal work that wasn't in, overhead stuff that wasn't in their grooves. And that helps with the detail, helps to differentiate. So while it's tempting to use loops, and in this situation it's easy and suited the purpose, you've got to modify. Oh, actually the big thing that I did with this, sorry, before I forget, that's 6, so we've got to drag that back to 3 bars. This is the speed, that the tempo that the loop was. And that's just way too happy. Ugh. It's not to say it's bad, it just doesn't suit this piece. So, halve it. So we get that real plodding feel. So even though the main sequence is running at 108 BPM, in actual fact the drum is at 54 BPM. So if somebody were counting time on this, they'd come out and say, yeah, your piece is at 54 beats per minute. That's why it seems so slow. But by choosing very carefully to run our drums and our guitars at slightly different times from each other, not as in different tempos, but variants of the same core tempo, then we get that feeling of faster guitars, slower drums. We could have just written the whole thing at 54, but it just would have made some of the guitar stuff a bit harder where I wanted to use 16ths, but in the reality, I don't think I've used any 16ths anyway. So drums in, I just kept adding the parts that we needed, like for our intro. While that's not directly our chord progression, it does carry a fair amount of what happens in these situations and is very related to our chord progression. And by being down, boom, 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 it's actually showing people what's going to be in there. So in our first 4 bars, I use 4 bars because this is a slower style in which we don't need to get straight into the then bringing in the drums, but they really needed to be unique. So I lent on something I got out of their intros, but really modified it to suit myself. So it starts and starts again. If you listen to the piece, it very much does that. If you listen to the guitars and bass together, I'm deliberately using a kind of disharmony right from the beginning to say, this is going to be challenging music. This is meant to be uncomfortable. And then the second time round, I remove the disharmony. So that's our section. Oh, I've also dragged in a fill from the power drums. That's it. The next bit composed was this. Now it takes a little bit of time and extra detail if you want to do, well, anything good, particularly if you want to do genre work. You have to sort of get in the details. But again, understand the details from the impact that they have. Don't just go, oh, well, Skrillex put a riser here, so I have to put a riser here, because then your riser ends up feeling sticky taped on. It's poor, because what happens is that everything else around it stops, because all you've got there is a riser. And I hear quite a few tracks that happen. It's like something's written along, it's going somewhere, stop. Start again. It's not the way it goes. You've always got to be thinking in terms of more than just the one element. So next bit. Oh, look, it's our intro. That's actually where our intro came from. Because once I got to here, I thought, yep, I got a nice doomy feel for my verse. But metal, even doom metal, tends to start to have its faster bits. So I worked this guitar progression. Very simple. With all 3 of them doing the same thing, the bass and the guitars, you get a really chunky sound. And then the drums. This one I had to put a little bit more effort in, and this is where knowing how the mechanics of the style and the instruments work really helps you tremendously. Like if you're trying to emulate a certain sound or feel, you have to know why that sound or feel happens, how it got there in the first place, what is about the mechanics of the instruments or the environment in which the players were living that created that feel. So here, using double kick, thankfully MT comes with separate voicings so that we can have multiples of certain instruments without them chopping each other off. Now with extreme metal, death metal, what have you, all of that, modern metal, it uses a double kick. I hate hearing them called egg beaters. It just annoys me. It's a double kick. They've been used in rock since at least the 60s. Initially, it used to be 2 kick drums, sometimes just both beating at the same time. Sometimes one was for show. And then they went into having 2 actual beaters. So you need 2 feet to work the things. And stylings vary from player to player, and you really got to understand that. Some of the amazing things that they do that sound like almost triple kick drums is using a tom, often a side tom, a floor tom within that, and triplets play a pretty big part in that. So while triplets aren't necessarily used in the guitars and the other parts of the music, the sudden appearance of triplets in the drum rhythm really stands out. And if you're not aware, a triplet is 3 in the space of 2. So if I were to draw out 1/16 and another 16th, that's 2 of them. If I move to triplets, I have 1, 2, 3. See, they end at the same time, but we've got 3 within that timing. Triplets are actually incredibly natural to the human form. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 is very, very easy for us. I don't quite know why. Someone, an anthropologist somewhere will be able to explain why. Our heartbeats sort of boom, 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 boom. Sort of in a triplet, maybe that's why. But within dance styles, whether the slower waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or in triplet-based music, so where there's like kinds of swing, country music, a lot of jazz era type dance music uses triplets in it. So it's danced as a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 back step, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 back step. So probably Charleston's jitterbugs, a lot of that sort of stuff, swing type things. The feet are actually doing a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Sounds complex, but flows surprisingly well, and it's found its modern form in metal, interestingly enough. So here I've used an interplay between straight 16th notes and triplets, particularly between the snare, which tends to play straight 16ths, and then the kick, which plays its triplets. You can get away without doing that kind of stuff if you've not got to the point where you understood it, but it really sparks things up if you do. So a lot of this was modified or even created to suit. I can't remember because this was a few days ago and I've been busy in a lot of other things, but that provides a little interlude. If you watch the last one with Jake's song, you had his verse, his chorus, and then a little interlude, a little couple of bar gaps. So I kept that format here, and then I've got my verse, little gap. Let's everyone have a breathe, and it's also giving a release because this moves so slowly. And the vocal makes it move even more slowly. So it provides a real release from the being held back. It's suddenly, oh, go kids, run, be free. Second verse really is exactly the same, only I've modified a little bit of some of the way guitar parts are delivered. Actually, no, honestly, it is largely the same. No, sorry, I fibbed to you. I do fib to you. I have made them... I've taken everything and put it to the chug. So both guitars are now playing guitar 2's initial line, which was the chug. I knew I'd done this somewhere. And that adds just a point of difference as we go into the second verse, because it's exactly the same material. But it stands out. This one is simply because I had to shorten the echo time on guitar 1 because it was designed for the longer, more flowing lines. And if I didn't slow it down at this point, then the whole thing fell in a nasty heap. Gets to the end, exactly the same. That's effectively our chorus. Third time round. Seeing I'd had both guitars play guitar 2's line, this time round I had both guitars play guitar 1's line. Gives a sense of familiarity, but a sense of movement as well. And we go into the next verse again. And I introduce the organ. It's quite low in the mix. The guitars are playing exactly the same as here, but the new thing is the organ, which plays literally these two things. And notice while this is getting more active, this becomes a little less active. We hear the big leap here as we go up, but we don't hear it here because, remember, I've moved those notes to deliberately constrain it. The guitars are being more interesting. We've constrained this. It doesn't want to stick out because it's about to. All that is doing is working around these guitars. So if we put our organ... And then the second time round, I've actually taken the guitars to play the same line as the organ. Remember, pre-polyphonic music, commonly all playing exactly the same notes. Different octaves, but same notes. Now, I could have finished the piece just here. But being a little perverse, I wanted to make it drag on a little bit more. Like everyone has to have their extra little bit. I'm last. No, I'm last. I'm last. And so it's not a thing that you're going to necessarily want to rush into on your first song, or it'll probably fall to pieces, but give it a go. But be prepared to let it go if it's causing you more problems than good. And that took quite a bit of time to do, to make sure that my points and my instruments were playing as they would. So it's some element of the big finish. Band goes through, they got through, the song's basically finished, and then they're looking for that big finish. and it's a variant of it. It's not the tidiest one I've ever heard, but one thing with doom is that it's often played, or stoner rock, it's often played to feel untidy. If it's a poor band, it just sounds bad, thoughtless. But if it's a good band, and I won't pretend this is, then it sounds great. It's a different feel from what you're used to. That's basically it. And then I'd got the structure already laid out. You will notice there are some marked similarities, very deliberate. There's marked similarities with our overall structure between Jake's song and this. I wanted to show that the differences between a perfect, neat and tidy little rock pop song of, sort of 50s, 60s is no different really from a doom metal song. And that's not to denigrate either, but just to show you that the delivery is what makes it different, not any other kind of technicality. As soon as you're focusing on technicalities, you're missing the point, because the feeling, the psychology of the listener is exactly the same whether they're listening to Roy Orbison or Cathedral, Winter. It's exactly the same. And you want to play on that. And then, as I said, I just added these vocals, which are awful.
Saved by the night.
That's it. It's as simple as that. I wasn't overly concerned with the vocals because they're only meant to provide a flavour. Besides, there were bands, especially in the early days of extreme metal, early death metal. There were several bands that just screamed garbage. It's a thing. I hope you have found this interesting. I also hope you've been open-minded enough to view this even if you don't see this as being your exact genre, because you see how same it is, and that we can create a process that works no matter what we're working on. No, I don't plan on writing an EDM one just because I have no interest in EDM and no real understanding of how it works. I mix it sometimes, and can enjoy it when I do, but generally have no feel for it, no particular desire towards it. Whereas I do have a desire towards metal, so playing around within that form, understanding it better, being able to deliver my own versions of it does appeal. But it doesn't matter. There's very little difference at the heart of what we do, so you can use this exact same format, not to limit what you do, but to give you the freedom to have a stronger platform and do what you want to do better. Any questions, ask down below. If you'd like to hire me to help you either developing your songs, or my greatest interest in working with other people is to some extent development, but more in the record producer side, which is helping you do the things that you need to do, the thinking stuff, which I talk about at length here, and of course, once you've got everything down of mixing it, making it sound lovely. But if you're interested in any of that, there'll be a link down below you can follow to establish a working relationship with me as well. Either way, delighted to hear from you. I will leave you and let this whole thing play.